Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu ta'ala wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een wa ba'd. So today I want to go through quite a long bit of text in commentary. So it's not from the original text, but it's related to a bit that I read right at the end last week, and but I never got around to explaining, but it's quite significant. So it's to do with how different obligations apply to different people in different ways. So inshallah, I want to go through that today. Just to quickly repeat that bit that I'm talking about. So right at the end last week, I read the following paragraph in which Imam Muhasibi says, وَارْضَ بِمَا أَرَادَكَ اللَّهُ بِهِ قال ابن مسعود رضي الله عنه ارض بما قسم الله لك تكن من أغنى الناس واجتنب ما حرم الله عليك تكن من أورع الناس وأدي ما افترض الله عليك تكن من أعبد الناس. I've already translated it, but I'll do it again. That be pleased with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has intended for you. Ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu said, be pleased with what Allah has apportioned to you, what means the part that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has destined for you and given to you, and you will be the most wealthy of people. Meaning that because you will have contentment in the heart, in your heart, it will be as though you'll be as content as the wealthiest of people. And then he says, and refrain from that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made haram, and you will be the most scrupulous or the most pious of people, and fulfill what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made obligatory upon you, and you will be the greatest of worshippers. So there's an interesting, there's different ways to look at this actually. Shaykh Abdul Fattah in commentary quotes this really long piece from Ibn al-Qayyim rahmatullahi alayhi in I'lam al-Muwaqqi'een, which I kind of want to read out to you. But let me begin by saying that one way in which we can understand what he says in terms of refrain from what Allah has made haram and you'll be the most pious of people. Generally, when we think about piety, we assume that staying away from the haram is the minimum. Staying away from the haram is the minimum. And then he says, fulfill your fara'id, fulfill what has been made obligatory upon you, you'll be the greatest of worship. But we always assume that fulfilling the obligations are the bare minimum. So how does this work? Well, firstly, if you think of it in terms of if refrain from the haram as you should, meaning as expected of you, by fully understanding what is prohibited for you, both in general terms and in specific terms. So some things that are haram for everyone, you avoid those, but also things that are not recommended for you as a person. So you have a good understanding of yourself and how particular sins affect you. And the same goes for obligations upon you, meaning you fully take on board what is obligatory upon you. So you understand all of your fard ayn, but you also understand all of your fard kifaya, and you respond to those. Well, if your understanding of the halal and the haram it can be as sophisticated as that, then you are indeed, up there with the most pious of people and one of the greatest worshippers, because you're worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has demanded of you, meaning you may not appear to be somebody who conforms to a stereotypical understanding of worship. Lots of tahajjud, kind of very insular, staying away from people, lots of dhikr on your own, lots of time on your own, the kind of the stereotype of the worshipper, right? Kind of taking care of his or her worship in a kind of private context, right? Which generally is the stereotype. Similarly, the idea of the haram, right? Staying away from the haram, the general assumption is that we might be talking about somebody who stays away from the haram, but also stays away from the doubtful, and also, you know, is really, really, really particular. Whereas this line seems to be taking a kind of minimalist view. Just stay away from what is haram. But here as well, what is haram and what isn't haram, there are nuances, that there may be nuances that are particular to the individual that results in in a different kind of in a different situation or a different scenario, that has to be taken into consideration. So one way to understand it is basically avoiding the haram, having properly understood the haram, and doing the obligations, having properly understood the obligations. So that's one meaning of a person being the most pious or the most scrupulous, even though, you know, they're not doing the conventional maximum. Another way to understand this is that a person who truly avoids all that is haram, a person that truly avoids all that is haram in all of the different facets of life, then it is very much likely that such a person would having one by one cut out the haram from his or her life, will end up in a state eventually that goes far beyond the minimum. Does that make sense? Meaning, in order to achieve the maximum standard, the highest standard of precaution and scrupulousness. So the word used here is awra'in nas, the most cautious of people with regards to the haram, the most conscious and God-fearing of people with regards to that which is haram. Now, somebody who is so careful about that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prohibited, that they consider the prohibited in every way possible, right? They consider it in the domain of worship. They consider it in the domain of the 5 pillars, right? So zakah, hajj, sawm, etc. They consider it in the domain of mu'asharat, in the domain of relationships, social relationships and family relationships, in the domain of maintaining ties with their kith and kin and so on. They consider that in the domain of friendships, of neighborly relationships, etc., etc. They consider it in the domain of rights of others and duties towards others. They also consider it in the domain of mu'amalat, in the domain of business dealings and financial dealings, and so on and so forth. Meaning, they go every facet of life. They try to both know and understand what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prohibited, and they try to bring it into practice in their lives. Chances are that that person has an attitude of caution, attitude of being careful with regards to what Allah has prohibited, that is so profound that, you know, that they will actually achieve the maximum station, right, of being the most careful, or the most scrupulous, or the most God-fearing in that regard. The same applies to somebody who is so careful about his fara'id. He might not, you know, from the outset may not appear to be particularly concerned about nawafil and things like that, but is so careful about their fara'id that, you know, they consider their fara'id in every single facet of life, not just in worship as well, yes, but also in their mu'asharat. So they consider fara'id in terms of their duties to their parents, in terms of their duties to their children, in terms of their duty to their wife or their husband, in terms of their duty to their relatives. All of these areas of life also have fara'id, also have obligatory deeds, also have commands that require, that carry the meaning of an obligatory duty towards Allah or towards society or towards family and so on. Their fara'id in terms of mu'amalat, for example, keeping your promise, for example, the obligation of, you know, there are obligations around how we have to do business, etc., etc., and so on. There are obligations that are fard kifaya, that apply to a person specifically, right? Not fard ayn, but fard kifaya. when a person is so particular about fulfilling all of their duties to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in terms of fara'id, then they get the tawfiq naturally to also end up doing their nawafil and their sunan, etc., and so on, because the spirit from which the motivation to fulfill their fara'id it comes from a place that also motivates them to do the nawafil. Or another way to look at it is to think in this way, that somebody who is that particular about their fara'id is possibly only that particular about their fara'id because they enjoy obedience, because they enjoy obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that comes from this, and because that comes from the spirit of enjoying obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they also obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the nawafil, or in the or they obey the Messenger of Allah in the sunan, and so on. So meaning that there is a spirit, there is a place from which precaution about haram that it comes from, or the being strict about the fara'id comes from, that also actually motivates them to stay away from makruhat or also fulfill their nawafil. So that's one aspect. The other thing to think about is and this is what Ibn al-Qayyim rahmatullahi alayhi points out, is that ibadah is not the same for everyone. Everybody's worship is not the same. And I really like this, and I think this is important, and I want to go through that. So there is this idea of you being the most worshipping of people, and assuming that there is a stereotype of worship that applies to you, and in fact, it's different. Different people's priorities in terms of worship are different based on who they are, and they have to understand this and know this. Okay? So I want to now go through the quote from Ibn al-Qayyim rahmatullahi alayhi. Okay, so Imam Ibn al-Qayyim rahmatullahi alayhi says in I'lam al-Muwaqqi'in, he says, Lillahi subhanahu ala kulli ahadin ubudiyatun bihasbi martabatihi siwa al-ubudiyyati al-'ammati allati sawwa bayna ibadihi fiha. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the right to a form of servitude over every single individual that applies to that person based upon who they are, based upon their status. So there is a duty, to word it in a different way, there is a duty of servitude to Allah upon us that applies to us according to our status, right? This is in addition to the duty of servitude, right? That is common for everyone. That is the same for everybody. So, for example, the fard in the case of fard ain, like salah, that is something in which we're all equal, right? Fard ain applies to everybody equally. However, in some fara'id, they're fard kifaya, and therefore they apply to people, or perhaps even some fard ains apply to people in a different way based on their status. So Ibn al-Qayyim says, فعلى العالم من عبودية نشر السنة والعلم الذي بعث الله به رسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم ما ليس على الجاهل وعليه عبودية الصبر على ذلك ما ليس على غيره. So the first part is quite clear. He says, therefore there is upon the scholar there is the duty of servitude by way of spreading the sunnah, propagating the sunnah and propagating knowledge, the knowledge which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent his messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam with, that isn't applicable to the ignorant person. So to the educated alim, the obligation of propagating the sunnah and the knowledge of Quran and sunnah is it's much more applicable than a person who isn't educated in the Quran and sunnah, right? So a alim and a non-alim, al-alim wal-jahil, a non-alim and a non-alim, the obligation of propagating knowledge are not the same, they're different. And then he says, Then he goes into a more subtle area and says, وَعَلَيْهِ عُبُودِيَّةُ الصَّبْرِ عَلَى ذَلِكَ مَا لَيْسَ عَلَى غَيْرِهِ. And on that alim, given that he has a greater duty to propagate, similarly, he also has a greater duty to be patient over any suffering or any struggle faced in that path. So this is where he moves from what to you and me might be obvious, which is the obligation of an alim to propagate knowledge, to something that is a little bit more subtle, which is that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed a person with the rank of knowledge and with the rank of ilm, then not only do they have the obligation to propagate that ilm and to teach it, but there is also an obligation upon them as ulama to also be willing to struggle in that path, or be much more persevering, much more patient when they face struggles and difficulties in the way of propagating the sunnah and propagating knowledge. And then he gives another example. وَعَلَى الْحَاكِمِ مِنْ عُبُودِيَّةِ إِقَامَةِ الْحَقِّ وَتَنْفِيذِهِ وَإِلْزَامِهِ مَنْ هُوَ عَلَيْهِ بِهِ وَالصَّبْرِ عَلَى ذَلِكَ وَالْجِهَادِ عَلَيْهِ مَا لَيْسَ عَلَى الْمُفْتِي. And he gives a comparison that, and upon the ruler, there is the servitude to Allah, meaning the duty to Allah, of establishing the truth, of executing the truth, i.e. executing the deen, and establishing it in society, and enforcing it upon those over whom he has rule, enforcing it upon those over whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has granted him authority and rule. So therefore enforcing the sharia, etc., in society. And then, so he has this duty, and he has the duty of being patient over that, and and the duty of going through the tough decisions and the struggles of jihad, etc. That is not incumbent upon the mufti, meaning that the way in which that duty applies to the hakim, to the ruler, is not the same as how that duty would apply to the scholar. That duty isn't on the scholar. That's now a duty upon the ruler. So can you see how based on status now, it's different. The ruler doesn't have the obligation of teaching. That is upon the alim. The alim doesn't have the obligation of ruling by the hukum of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and executing the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in society, and enforcing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's law, and struggling through jihad, etc., in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by defending other people, by removing injustice, etc. That obligation is upon the ruler in a way that it isn't upon the scholar. Then he says, وَعَلَى الْغَنِيِّ مِنْ عُبُودِيَّةِ أَدَاءِ الْحُقُوقِ الَّتِي فِي مَالِهِ مَا لَيْسَ عَلَى الْفَقِيرِ. And upon the wealthy person, there is the duty of serving by way of fulfilling the rights that are due upon his wealth, that is not upon a poor person. Meaning, compared to the poor person, there is a far greater duty upon the wealthy person. And then he says, another example, وَعَلَى الْقَادِرِ عَلَى الْأَمْرِ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَالنَّهْيِ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ بِيَدِهِ وَلِسَانِهِ مَا لَيْسَ عَلَى الْعَاجِزِ فِيهَا. The obligation upon somebody who is capable of commanding good and forbidding evil, either physically by his hands or with his tongue, that isn't upon somebody who doesn't have that capacity. There's a quite a substantial amount of relativity, for example, in that particular example. So, for example, I have authority over my sons, right? So I have a greater duty of command of amr bil ma'ruf nahy anil munkar, of enjoining good and forbidding evil towards my children than towards somebody else's children, right? Because when it comes to the domain of my family as a father, I have authority and capacity over there. When it comes to somebody else's family, I don't have authority and capacity there. Right? So therefore, I don't have as big an obligation towards enjoining good and forbidding evil, right? I don't in a context where I have limited control, and limited capacity, or limited ability to affect an outcome. So capacity is not just about I can do it, but it's about achieving the outcome. So if you don't have the capacity to achieve the outcome, or for example, if your attempt at trying to achieve the outcome of enjoining good is going to result in harm because there's no capacity. So for example, you turn up and you try to enjoin good and forbid evil in somewhere where if you did it, you would actually put people off Islam. You'd actually put people off Islam. That is a situation where not only do you not have the capacity, but your ability to affect the outcome, to bring about the outcome, is not only non-existent, but the opposite is likely, meaning it's likely that you'll actually put people off of Islam. So in that scenario, what should you do? Do you now say, oh, but I have to give da'wah, or I have to enjoin good and forbid evil, so I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway? No. So over here, what's happened is you haven't considered the relative way in which the command of enjoining good and forbidding evil applies to you in that situation. So in that situation, not only is commanding good and forbidding evil not obligatory upon you, but it's perhaps something that you shouldn't do, right? The way, for example, me as a father, I have authority. The authority that I rely upon to enjoin good and forbid evil when it comes to my children, right? With wisdom, of course, bil hikmati wal maw'idati al hasana, with wisdom and good counsel. If I was to apply that same, if I was to exercise that same right upon someone else's child without the authority. So it's somebody who, for example, I don't have a relationship with. Their children don't know who I am. They don't call me uncle or whatever. They don't respect me because I'm their father's friend. It's just some random person. Then chances are the impact upon them will be a negative one, right? They will feel as though I'm one of the, they'll develop a stereotype about me as a religious person who basically doesn't know his limits or doesn't know his boundaries, etc., etc. Does that make sense? So actually, there's a damage that is being done here. So this is where Ibn Qayyim rahmatullahi alayhi is explaining that there is a nuance. There is a nuance to how obligations apply to us that has to take in that is relative, particularly in the domain of things that are fard kifaya in nature. Okay. Now you can now go on other examples. You know, a doctor has a duty to serve. Given that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed them with that ability, that doesn't exist upon somebody who isn't a doctor, right? You know, and so on and so forth. You can keep going, right? You can keep using other examples, but particularly in the domain of deen and propagating the deen and serving the deen and so on, and serving society for the sake of the deen, there is definitely this relativity in the space of fard kifaya that has to be taken into consideration. Not only that, when it comes to fard kifaya, it's also necessary to be pragmatic and consider the extent to which we are able to affect the outcome. So it's no point jumping into something that I actually realistically cannot achieve a result. I shouldn't jump into it just because it's an obligation on the community, but rather my job is, if there is something that I can contribute, it should be to try to make sure that the right person is put forward who's best placed to bring about that outcome. And then it then becomes then the fard kifaya upon me isn't to do it myself, but to support the person who is this right person who is doing it. This is often ignored by the Muslim community. And therefore everybody develops a hero syndrome. Everyone's a maverick. Everyone wants to do a bit of everything. Okay. So essentially what you end up with is there's no distribution of load, right? We're not making sure that the most qualified people for a particular job within the domain of serving our religious interests are the people that are doing the job. It's just anyone and everyone. It's just there's lots and lots of kind of people who are mavericks, who just want to go ahead and do it, irrespective of their qualification or lack thereof. I hope that makes sense. All right. So moving on. So that was a bit of explanation from me, right? I'm going to read a bit more from Imam Ibn al-Qayyim rahmatullahi alayhi. He says, وتكلم يحيى بن معاذ الرازي يوما في الجهاد والأمر بالمعروف والنهي عن المنكر فقالت له امرأة هذا واجب قد وضع عنا، تعني معشر النساء، فقال هبي أنه قد وضع عنكن سلاح اليد واللسان فلم يوضع عنكن سلاح القلب، فقالت صدقت جزاك الله خيرا. Ibn al-Qayyim rahmatullah tells the story of Yahya ibn Mu'adh al-Razi, who one day was speaking about jihad and enjoining good and forbidding evil. Al-Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar. Jihad and Amr bil Ma'ruf Nahy anil Munkar. And a woman said to him, this is an obligation that has been removed from us. This is a duty that has been removed from us women. Okay? Meaning that, we don't, yes, you're giving a lecture on this, you're giving a talk on, you're enjoining us to do this, but us women, it isn't obligatory upon us, right? It's not our job to enforce. That is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed upon the men. So Yahya ibn Mu'adh al-Razi said, yes, I concede the point. Let's concede the point that it has been, that obligation isn't upon you the way it is upon the men, or it has been, or rather that let's concede that the weapon of the hands, the physical weapons and the verbal weapons have been taken from you, meaning you're not expected to directly intervene on situations because of the fact that you may not have the power to affect it. So you may not be able to in a given situation, if you did Amr bil Ma'ruf Nahy anil Munkar, it may not actually result in the outcome that you want, because you're not deemed to, in that particular situation, not deemed to have the power to be able to make it happen. Now, obviously, the same thing applies to men, but in the case of women, the men, because of what they have been physically endowed with, are able to affect greater power and withstand resistance more than the average woman. The average man can withstand more than the average woman can, and as a result, Yahya ibn Mu'adh is making this point. But he says, however, that doesn't mean you have no obligation. He says, فَلَمْ يُوضَعْ عَنْكُنَّ سِلَاحُ الْقَلْبِ. In the context of Amr bil Ma'ruf Nahy anil Munkar, where you cannot bring about a desired outcome physically or with your tongue, for example, because it's not appropriate, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not removed from you the obligation of the weapon of the heart. Meaning, just because you can't do the first two doesn't mean you do not hate the deed from your heart, because the hadith says, "Man ra'a minkum munkaran falyughayyirhu biyadihi." Whoever sees an evil, then let him stop it with his hand, let him change it with his hand. فَإِن لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ فَبِلِسَانِهِ. And if he can't stop it with his hands, then let him stop it with his tongue. فَإِن لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ فَبِقَلْبِهِ. And if he can't stop it with his hands, then let him stop it with his tongue. وَذَلِكَ أَضْعَفُ الْإِيمَانِ. And that is the weakest position of Iman. Yahya ibn Mu'adh says that in the context that I'm speaking about jihad and intervening physically, that might not apply to you in this context as women, but the context of actually wanting or actually supporting it with your hearts, making dua for it, or if it's to do with stopping an evil, then disliking that evil from your hearts, that obligation has not been taken away from you. Having said that, Yahya ibn Mu'adh was commenting on what he was particularly addressing in that talk. What the principle actually is the same. The principle applies in the same way to men and women, meaning that what you can't do, you don't intervene in, but what you can do, you do intervene in. And over here, there's lots, and the spectrum is broad, meaning there's lots and lots of situations. A mother, for example, can intervene on her sons, even though they're men, because she has authority over them, right? And she can do Amr bil Ma'ruf Nahy anil Munkar in that context. So there are nuances there. So don't misunderstand this particular quote. Yahya ibn Mu'adh was making the specific point that just because something doesn't apply to you doesn't mean everything doesn't apply to you. There is always something that applies, right? Meaning everybody has a martaba, everybody has a capacity, everyone has a station, a maqam, a position that they're able to use, and they have to begin to understand obligations upon them based upon the nuances that apply to that position. Okay, and then Ibn al-Qayyim continues, وَقَدْ غَرَّ إِبْلِيسُ كَثِيرًا مِنَ الْخَلْقِ بِأَنْ حَسَّنَ لَهُمْ الْقِيَامَ بِنَوْعٍ مِنَ الذِّكْرِ وَالْقِرَاءَةِ وَالصَّلَاةِ وَالصِّيَامِ وَالزُّهْدِ فِي الدُّنْيا وَالْإِنْقِطَاعِ وعطلوا هذه العبوديات فلم يحدثوا قلوبهم بالقيام بها وهؤلاء عند ورثة الأنبياء أي العلماء الصادقين ممن لا غناء فيهم للدين فإن الدين هو القيام لله بما أمر به فتارك حقوق الله التي تجب عليه أسوأ حالا عند الله ورسوله من مرتكب المعاصي. Really kind of strong statement. He says that, and the shaitan or Iblis has deceived a lot of people by adorning in front of their eyes certain modes of worship, such as the remembrance of Allah, abundant recitation of the Quran, prayer, fasting, staying away from the dunya, right? So asceticism, staying away from the dunya, living a simple life, and disconnecting from society. He said there are people who the shaitan has deceived them into thinking that somehow this is it. This is all they're about. They're about disconnecting, worshipping, and just worship and pray, etc., and being known as a bit of a hermit, right? This kind of life has been adorned in their eyes by the shaitan, and in doing so, they have completely neglected these other forms of worship. So some of the forms of worship that we've spoken about: enjoining the good, forbidding the evil, striving in the path of Allah, spreading deen, spreading sunnah, spreading knowledge, being with people, and so on. So these are some of the things that they have neglected to do, and it never occurs to them. فَلَمْ يُحَدِّثُوا قُلُوبَهُم. They never internally consider themselves to also have a duty to fulfill those other duties, these other types of servitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says that this is the case. This is also the case among people who are supposed to be inheritors of the prophets, i.e., who are supposed to be scholars of the deen. And he says the reason why this is a deception from the shaitan is because deen is about doing whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded us to do. Deen is about doing whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded us to do. That means that in certain situations, the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can be dynamic, meaning it isn't just a specific prescription of certain things, but it can vary from situation to situation, and you have to take that into consideration. And so he says that anybody who abandons the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that have become obligatory upon him or her is actually worse in the eyes of Allah and His Messenger than somebody who commits acts of disobedience, i.e. acts of sin. So according to Ibn al-Qayyim, he's saying people who carve out a little space for themselves and completely ignore the plight of the ummah, or completely ignore other duties that need to be fulfilled in society, meaning, let me put it this way, let me put it in simple terms. People who only think about their personal fard ayn and never consider how they can contribute to fard kifaya. I'm going to put it like that for you, right? Meaning a role that is communal in nature. They don't consider how communal obligations apply to them. People who do that, according to Ibn al-Qayyim, such people are worse than those who commit sin. A'udhu billahi min dhalik. Right? May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbid it. So it's an interesting point, isn't it? Well, if you want to understand that in technical terms, it's very simple, isn't it? Because in technical terms, these people are then they're abandoning obligations. They're neglectful of obligations. A fard kifaya is still a fard, right? If there is a fard kifaya, you can contribute to. Then it's a fard, isn't it? It's not a fard you can neglect. What does this say? So I've said many times in many places and to my students that the Muslim community nowadays has an understanding of fard kifaya that is too simplistic, right? And that gives the individuals the license to ignore things that they actually can have an impact on. And they ignore it because they think somebody else is doing it. They never consider their role, right? This kind of passive mindset results in people not realizing that there is a fard kifaya that they should be fulfilling, that is indeed a fard, right? Because they think somebody else is going to do it. It's not my job. Someone else is doing it or has to do it. What am I supposed to do? But the point is that the nature of a fard kifaya is that everyone in society has to be concerned about them, but some deliver. But if you completely neglect it, then you're not concerned about it either. Then how do you know if it is being sufficiently fulfilled? So the way a fard kifaya works is, if it is sufficiently being fulfilled, yes, by some people, then it is fulfilled on behalf of everyone. But how do you know if a fard kifaya is sufficiently being fulfilled if you have no concern for it? Meaning that you're completely blind and heedless to it. How do you know it's being fulfilled? You can't possibly know. So fard kifayas are things that basically everybody has to be aware of. Everybody has to have a degree of consciousness about things that are necessary, that need to be done for the sake of the community. Okay. So the point I was trying to make is that we have, as a community, we have a very simplistic understanding of fard kifaya, which actually impacts us in terms of the collective health of the Muslim community as a community. Okay, so and then he says, ومن له خبرة بما بعث الله به رسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم وبما كان عليه هو وأصحابه رأى أن أكثر من يشار إليهم بالدين أي من أولئك المتزاهدين المنقطعين هم أقل الناس نصرة لدين الله والله المستعان. Really harsh statement, but it's not me. It's Ibn al-Qayyim rahmatullahi alayhi saying this. He's saying anybody that has any experience or knowledge of what Allah has sent His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam with, and with the example that him and the Sahaba want, meaning anybody who understands the way of the Prophet and the companions, then will see, such a person will see that most of the people who are pointed to as being religious, or people of deen, people of religious, and all of these people who appear to be disinterested in the dunya, appear to be these super pious religious types, disconnected from people, disconnected from the world, you know, and so on. These are the people who are least help. They are the people who are least helpful in the cause of Allah's deen. What do I mean by that? In the cause of Allah's deen means in the cause of protecting the deen, in the cause of propagating the deen, in the cause of preserving the deen, in the cause of fulfilling the wider communal obligations or the communal needs of the ummah and of society that result in the protection of the deen and protection of people, right? These people are least interested or least involved in such work. So yeah, that's a really, really strong statement, and for the most part it is true. I think the balance is something that is achieved by not everybody, but some of the ulama achieve the balance by both being people who are active in society, but being active in society does not make them neglectful of worship. That's the balance. So a lot of people nowadays nowadays you end up with this dichotomy, isn't it? You end up with activists, and you have these kind of introverted types who they're not interested in activism, they're just interested in worshipping or taking care of their religiosity, right? There's two. And for some reason, these guys, they're not active enough in the community, and the activists are not very strong when it comes to worship, right? And there needs to be some sort of balance. We cannot give the responsibility of representing our deen and protecting our deen to people who do not care about their ibadah. Does that make sense? Nor can we expect the Muslim societies and the deen itself to be protected and preserved by people who just care about their own individual worship. There has to be a kind of middle way of balance. And he continues kind of along that vein and says, وَأَيُّ دِينٍ وَأَيُّ خَيْرٍ فِي مَنْ يَرَى مَحَارِمَ اللَّهِ تُنْتَهَكْ وَحُدُودَهُ تُضَاعُ وَدِينَهُ يُتْرَكُ وَسُنَّةُ رَسُولِهِ صلى الله عليه وسلم يُرْغَبُ عَنْهَا وَهُوَ بَارِدُ الْقَلْبِ سَاكِتُ اللِّسَانِ شَيْطَانٌ أَخْرَسٌ. Really harsh. He says, what kind of religiosity and what kind of good is in the person who sees the haram being committed and the boundaries of Allah being wasted and God's religion being abandoned? So people are leaving the deen, right? And you've got people who are calling, who all they care about is calling people to, all they care about is their own little circle or their own personal religiosity or their own little clique, and so on and so forth. But there's, I'm not going to contextualize this because it's going to sound like I'm speaking about people, and that's not my intention. But you get the point. Let's just stick to it in principle. So he's saying, and so he says, God's deen is being abandoned. Allah's deen is being abandoned. The Messenger of Allah's sunnah is people are turning away from the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, meaning the sunnah is no longer seen as popular or desirable, right? But yet these people are cold-hearted, are quiet. Their tongues are quiet. They're like a dumb devil. They're like a mute devil, meaning they're like a shaitan akhras, a mute shaitan. Meaning, what is the point of all of their worship and all of their individual dedication if that is what is happening around them, right? What is the benefit of their piety? Okay, it's a very, very harsh criticism, but it's, we don't have to take it literally. Ibn Qayyim rahmatullahi alayhi, it's a bit of a rant, but there is something to learn from it, though. Meaning, our job isn't really to now. So the worst thing that whoever's seeing this, whether you're on Facebook or whether you're in my class, the worst reaction you can have right now to what I've just translated from Ibn Qayyim rahmatullahi alayhi is to start imagining people who you think fit the description of what Ibn Qayyim has just said. If you're doing that right now, then you've completely missed the point of what this is about. So just look at the mirror and look at yourself. I look at myself. Don't look at anybody else. Which one of these people are you? And what can you do to achieve a balance? All right. If you're thinking about others, all right, then the point of this has already been lost. Okay. So Ibn Qayyim wasn't attacking anybody in particular. So his words, if his words are creating an image in our minds of someone that we know or a group that we can think of right now, then already we have missed the point. We've missed the point. We should just be reflecting on ourselves only. And then Ibn Qayyim, I'm going to finish off by saying that Ibn Qayyim says that, people pretending to be really, really caring for the deen and crying, etc., but yet not feeling pain and not willing to make sacrifices for the benefit of the deen. They're happy as long as their pockets are full. They're happy as long as their daily bread is met. but they're not willing to make any kind of sacrifice, to strive, to really put themselves through struggle for the deen. He says this is the stereotype of these people. And he says these people are the greatest calamity of the deen. They are the greatest trial of the deen. It's because of them that the deen basically ends up being wasted, or ends up being abandoned, or ends up weakening, and so on. In a nutshell, basically, this is what he's saying. And these people, he's saying that these people, they will achieve nothing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala except his wrath and his anger and his punishment on the Day of Judgment. Even though on the face of it, and he is saying this, on the face of it, he's saying that these people are people who might appear to be of immense worship. Okay, so again, let's focus on ourselves, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us from being of that kind of stereotype. And then he mentions that Imam Ahmad rahmatullahi alayhi and others have mentioned a narration that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will send a revelation will send an instruction to an angel in the form of revelation at one of the angels, that go and destroy a village by sinking it into the ground. And the angel will say, Lord, how can I do that when among them is such and such a person who is a worshipper, who is a great worshipper of yours? He spends all of his day worshipping you. And the reply from Allah will be that actually begin with him, because his face never changed because of me. Meaning, when I was being disobeyed, when people were going against my commands, when society was not implementing justice as I wanted, when my commands were not being implemented in society or in the land, his face never changed. He never showed any dislike of that, right? All he cared about was his own personal worship. So start with him. Start the punishment with him. Abu Umar ibn Abdul Barr says in his book At-Tamheed that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent a revelation to a prophet from one of his prophets. This is still Ibn al-Qayyim, by the way. A prophet from one of his prophets, that say to so-and-so person who is a worshipper, who is a zahid, meaning somebody disinterested in the dunya, kind of keeps to himself and dedicates himself to worship. Say to him that as for your asceticism, as for your disinterest in the dunya, that has actually gained you a lot of comfort in yourself. It's given you a lot of peace of mind. This is really interesting, actually, the wording of this. He says, as for your kind of personal worship, he said, it has granted you a lot of peace of mind in the dunya. And as for you disconnecting yourself from society and from people, that has granted you a lot of respect, meaning people see you as that guy who's just completely dedicated himself to worship. So people speak of you in these glorious terms. So he said that has gained you a lot of respect. But what have you done? وَلَكِنْ مَاذَا عَمِلْتَ فِي مَا لِي عَلَيْكَ? What have you done about the duties that I have placed upon you, the duties that you owe to me? And the man will say, Lord, and what duties do I owe you? What duties do I owe you? And he said, هَلْ وَالَيْتَ فِيَّ وَلِيًّا أَوْ عَادَيْتَ فِيَّ عَدُوًا? Right? See, and the response comes back that have you ever befriended somebody for my sake? Let me translate it in this way. Have you ever shown loyalty to somebody for my sake? Meaning giving them protection, giving them guardianship, giving them help for my sake, right? You've gone and helped somebody because that person needed help, befriended them, shown them love, shown them loyalty for my sake. And have you ever become an enemy of someone for my sake? Meaning, have you ever gone and in my cause, for the sake of Allah, for the sake of the deen, for the sake of the messenger of Allah, for the sake of the propagation of the deen, for the sake of the preservation of the deen, upset somebody? The point being that is what you owe to me. It isn't just about you you know, kind of hiding away in a cave and doing your own thing, but you have obligations that interact, that are far more dynamic and that interact with people. Okay, so that's basically, it's quite a long piece, but I wanted to share it with you to show that there are these nuances, and these nuances can be unpacked. You can write many, many, many volumes on this. These nuances can be unpacked. But bottom line is that there's the standard, then there is you, and what you can do and how you can serve the deen, and how you can, and how what your relationship is with fard kifaya, particularly with communal duties and communal obligations, is something that actually shouldn't be looked upon simplistically, but actually requires a lot of thought. Okay, inshallah. And it's something that the Muslim community needs to be strategically thinking about. This is about strategic thought and thinking strategically about my wider role in society, individually, but also about our wider role in society collectively. Okay, inshallah ta'ala. Okay, I'm going to stop there. If there's any questions, please, you know, send them in. I've been thinking today that maybe I'll okay, so what the question is it possible to mention what examples are there of fard kifaya that are currently being neglected by the UK Muslim Ummah? Whoa, I mean, you want me to start? You want me to start on that one? The Ibn al-Qayyim's book. Let me answer Brother Naveed's question first. So Ibn al-Qayyim's book is I'lam al-Muwaqqi'in. I don't. It may be translated in English. I'm not sure. All right. How would I translate that name? I'lam al-Muwaqqi'in. Announcing the I'lam al-Muwaqqi'in. I don't know. Announcing the people of great. I'lam al-Muwaqqi'ina. It's called I'lam al-Muwaqqi'in. Okay. I don't know how translators translate it. Okay. So mentioning examples of fard kifayas that are currently being neglected by the UK Muslim Ummah. Okay, so let's start. Let's go. Let's give you some examples. So number one, I have a presentation on this actually. So firstly, let me give you the example of a state. If we were a state, if the UK Muslim community was a state, it was a country, it was a small country. There are countries that are less than 3 million strong. Okay. We are a community of 3 million. We could be a country. Qatar has less people than us. Then as a country, what would be the main priorities for us to take care of, spend our money on, right? The main strategic priorities for us to spend our money on to ensure that we 3 million as a community, right? Our deen, our iman, so our iman, our deen, our religiosity, our knowledge of the deen is protected for ourselves and for our future generations. What are the key things that we would have to take care of, right? So that would be the most important thing that from a Shari'i point of view that we would focus on. If we did that, if we thought in those ways, if we were to think as a state, it would be our education, right? Meaning consistent with the idea that the Prophet ﷺ was sent as a teacher, إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ مُعَلِّمًا, that the first verse of the Quran is Iqra, that the Prophet ﷺ's main duty is يُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةَ وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ, that the Prophet taught people the book, he taught them wisdom, and he purified them. These were the key duties of the Prophet ﷺ, and kind of that's what those duties would be mirrored in terms of the main strategic objectives to be delivered to society. If you look at the budget of a country, the budget of a state, you would also see that a sizable proportion of its budget is spent on education, healthcare, that kind of thing. So we don't have to worry about healthcare, for example, in this country because we don't because we have the NHS, right? But we have to worry about education because the education system that our taxes pay for doesn't take care of our Islamic educational needs, and and at times works against it, works against our Islamic educational needs. So that means that in proportion to the way in which a government would spend on education, how the educational budget is significant for a government, that is exactly how we would fulfill, how seriously we would take education, right? That means that our time, effort, energy, money would basically be focused on that, and it would be high up the pecking order. Then would come our other things, right? Other things. If you think about the UK Muslim community and the way we operate, right? Our most important strategic needs come last, okay? So the way I measure it is I say, if you want to see what's important to the UK Muslim community, see where it spends money and see where it gives money. If you want to measure the priorities of the UK Muslim, see where it spends money. And you think about how it spends money on humanitarian needs. Now, if we were a country, our overall budget as a country, right, in terms of international aid, would be a tiny fraction of the overall budget after all of the key needs of the state are taken care of. The Muslim community spends the majority of its money on basically foreign aid. I'm not saying that that's not important. I'm saying that is not something that is that strategically is considered first. So from a Fard Kifaya point of view, in my opinion, Islamic education is almost across all minority communities throughout the world, right? And partly within the Muslim world as well. Education, Islamic education, not education, but Islamic education is a major Fard Kifaya that is neglected, okay? Then in the UK, it is the thing that is neglected is the work that needs to be done to ensure the preservation of Iman in future generations in the face of the challenges that their Iman faces in the current context. The idea is you analyze what are the things that are challenging the Iman of our children today. What can we do to combat those challenges, to protect their Iman today and to protect the Iman of the future? I would say there is almost no effort in this regard. So Fard Kifaya that is completely being neglected. All right. So this kind of responding to challenges and then looking ahead at creating resilience so that in the future we're able to tackle challenges, that's not been happening. Okay. And there's lots, but I'm just going to focus on that. When it comes to Fard Kifaya, the Muslim community simply understands janaza, and that's about it, right? That's about all we care about. There's no collective thinking about other wider Fard Kifayas. Okay? And we do humanitarian work for the sake of doing humanitarian work. It's just for the sake of doing it. It's first aid work, and for the most part, I'm really sorry to say this, but for the most part, it's to make ourselves feel better. It doesn't actually serve a function or purpose, other than to make ourselves feel better. The impact it has on the ground is minuscule, and it is done, it should be done, and it would be done, but it is done in reverse order, meaning that it should be 5th, 6th, 7th down in the priority list, but it's number 1, number 2 at the moment. Okay? If we were to measure importance based on money spent. For example, bricks and mortar of masjids is more important to us than the function of a masjid. Right? How do you prove that? Because we spend more money on the bricks and mortar of a masjid than the function of a masjid. Simple as that. I don't think anybody can dispute that. We would be happy to spend £2 million on a masjid and leave it empty. But we would not be willing to spend £2 million on a service, irrespective of whether we own a building or not. Does that make sense? We wouldn't spend £2 million on a service, on delivering a service for the Muslim community, irrespective of whether we have a building or not. We wouldn't. That would be considered a failure in the current Muslim psyche. However, we would be perfectly happy to fork out £2 million for a building that sat empty and did no services. Do you understand? And just had fancy marble and fancy taps and cost us another £50,000 a year to maintain. That's our attitude. These are things that require thought, and these are things that we have to basically fix. Do you understand? The crisis, the problem of youth, for example, completely being neglected, right? While masajid sit on money. Masajid are sitting on savings, while young people in the vicinity of the masjid are basically on drugs, you know, getting into prostitution, getting into crime, struggling with a low achievement, etc., etc. Families, fathers and mothers are struggling to bring up their children, and masajid are saving money. So these are serious issues, in my opinion. They're serious issues. And every time I talk to the Muslim community about it, there is this sense of resignation. What can you do? That's just how it is. It's just not good enough. Fard kifaya. It's kifaya, by the way. So yeah, so what I'm talking about, these are all examples of fard kifaya. But I think you mean, let me define it for you, right? A fard kifaya, there's two types of fard. So you know what a fard is, right? A fard is something that is obligatory, something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded and it must be done. However, so that's fard. However, a fard is either obligatory upon every single individual, every single person equally. That kind of fard is known as a fard ayn. So that's like the 5 times prayer. The 5 times prayer is fard ayn on every single individual, right? It's fard on every single individual. Fasting in Ramadan is fard on every single individual. Everybody that it is fard on has to do it. A fard ayn means everyone that it is, if it's fard on someone, they must do it. Someone else can't do it on their behalf. A fard kifaya is something that is fard on everyone as a community. It's fard on everybody as a community. If the community hands over the responsibility of fulfilling the fard to some people, and those people fulfill it on their behalf, then the fard is done by everyone. So it's fard on everybody, but everybody doesn't do it. Some people do it on behalf of everybody. That's called a fard kifaya. So for example, if a person dies, it's obligatory upon everyone to make sure that their janazah is done. But if 10 people take care of it, it's fulfilled on behalf of everyone. Do you understand? That's fard kifaya. Any other questions before we wrap up? I mean, so that's a very difficult question. How can we attempt to resolve the issues mentioned and change people's views towards taking care of fard kifaya? Well, it's difficult, but I mean, I would say, like for me, all I can do is I speak about it all the time, right? I speak about it all the time. I speak to everybody that I know about it, and I convince everybody that I know that. So everybody has a circle of concern, right, and a circle of influence. So in my circle of concern, that's the community at large, I speak about it. In my circle of influence, right, I try to make sure that I influence as many people as possible, my parents, my siblings, you know, my relatives, people who listen to me, people who I have some sort of advice, I have influence on people who listen to my advice. I try to make sure that when it comes to their concern, they're particularly concerned about the education of their children, and when it comes to their giving, they give towards educational causes. And my personal concern and my personal effort and energy, I try to exert it in that area, in the area that I feel is a priority. Now, obviously, you'll say, yeah, but different people have different priorities. Well, different people shouldn't have different priorities. The priority should be decided first collectively, right? based upon what the Sharia said our priorities should be, right? And then we should move. Then we should think about, then we should distribute. At the moment, what's happening is we decide priorities arbitrarily. Somebody decides, oh, nobody's doing this, I'm going to do it. They don't talk to anyone, they don't consult anyone, they just go ahead and they do it. They set up their own project and then they go and then they try to convince everybody because people are convinced through marketing efforts. People have to be, you have to do promotional work, and you have to kind of convince people through media that this work is important. You have no choice but to make it out. You have no choice but to use selling techniques to convince people that this is the most important task that the Muslim community has to do. But that's not how it should be, right? What should be happening is we should have clarity as a community about what our priorities are and how we're going to fulfill them. And we need to organize ourselves in that way. But look, it's easier said than done. Okay, so that's why I gave you an example of how I do it myself personally. So I refuse to give money to certain causes. I'm going to be really, it's going to sound really weird for you guys, but I don't give money to certain causes anymore. I come from my father brought me up to like never turn away from giving money, to giving charity. But I don't. I have to feel basically I give my money to educational causes and to strategic causes. That's what I do. Outside of that, I have to feel a very particular obligation, meaning in my mind, I have to think to myself, okay, there is a particular extraordinary reason why it's necessary for me to give to this other cause. And that includes masajid, by the way. So for example, I only give to my local masjid because I feel there is a particular reason why I must give to that masjid, right? But I wouldn't so easily give to just any old masjid. However, if a masjid convinced me that they have a very, very strong educational agenda and that they're very, very effective in protecting and preserving the deen and iman of the Muslim community, they have all of my support. I do anything for them. All right, so that's how I do it, and that it's up to you how you do it. But I can only give myself as an example because the problem is so bad that it's difficult to navigate. Okay, inshallah. Let's end it there. It's already 7:50. Okay, Jazakumullah khairan. That I thought that quote from Ibn Qayyim was really profound in this regard. And maybe I'll do a separate video of it or something, inshallah. Okay, everybody, Jazakumullah khairan for attending. Facebook people, if you've been watching, Jazakumullah khairan. Allah bless you. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us the tawfiq, inshallah, to understand our deen as it should be understood and to practice it and preserve it. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Subhanallah wa bihamdihi, subhanakallah wa bihamdihi, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Sallallahu ta'ala wa sallam ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.